and the Battle of Iwo Jima was fiercely fought between the Imperial Japanese Army. The United States began a 5-week offensive with the mission to capture the Japanese islands and their airfields. This battle ended up being one of the bloodiest battles of the Pacific War in data. It had a terrible result, with 7,000 American soldiers, 7,000 Japanese soldiers, and 18,375 killed in action. Although the United States ultimately won, the conflict between the two countries was not without much controversy. In this documentary, join us as we take a look at the Battle of Iwo Jima. Welcome to World War. Iwo Jima. The small volcanic island, located about 1,200 kilometers south of Tokyo, was the result of much debate among various U.S. military commanders. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific area, suggested that the United States should eventually seize the small island, suggesting that the capture of Iwo Jima would be a prelude to a much larger attack on the island of Okinawa. It is said that the Navy very much wanted this Battle of Okinawa. The attack on Okinawa was part of the Allied island jumping strategy. The strategy was to invade and occupy an island, establish a military base, and then advance toward Tokyo by attacking another island. Iwo Jima was located on the most direct route between the Mariana Islands, recently occupied by Japanese and American forces. General Henry Arnold of the U.S. Army Air Corps supported the idea of attacking Iwo Jima. He said an air base that could support his bomber force, known as Ekek's Bomber Command, and he said that if we eliminate the Japanese military, we can also eliminate the fighter planes that were intercepting the U.S. attack. Iwo Jima was later described as being well-suited as a fighter base to support long-range bombers. This argument soon persuaded the Joint Chiefs of Staff in Washington, but commanders and officials believed that the battle at Iwo Jima would be short and with few casualties. The plan to capture Iwo Jima was named Operation Detachment, and preliminary plans were developed. The ultimate goal of the battle was to maintain pressure on Japan and extend American control throughout the Western Pacific. The objectives of the operation were to weaken or eliminate naval and air forces on Iwo Jima and the Iwo Jima Islands, and to capture, occupy, and defend Iwo Jima, which would later become a U.S. airbase. Operation Detachment was later described as the most classic amphibious assault in recorded history. And because of its importance, only men who had proven themselves in previous battles were selected to command each unit. One such commander was Admiral Raymond Spruance, who I participated in the naval battle of the Philippine River in June. Spruance had an excellent reputation among his colleagues and was known for his calmness in times of crisis. His calm personality earned him the nickname Electric Brain, and he is considered one of the greatest admirals in American history. The first step of the plan was for troops of the 1st and 2nd Marine Divisions to land on the eastern beach, with the 3rd Marine Division to land on the same beach and provide support or defense as needed. The unit was then scheduled to move northeast to eventually capture the entire island, and some troops from that Marine Division were to be sent to the south to capture Mount Suribachi. In addition, the Landing Vehicle Tract, M-Track, which stands for Orbital Landing Vehicle, was also scheduled to land on the beach. This amphibious vehicle was similar to a tank and could carry 18 soldiers or 4,500 equipment. During the Battle of Iwo Jima, these vehicles were tasked with protecting the advancing infantry by penetrating them to a certain point and then using artillery and machine guns to suppress and drive the enemy away. Meanwhile, in the year 1944, Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi assumed command of the defense of Iwo Jima in June. He was considered one of the best field commanders in the Japanese Empire. At this point, the Japanese military recognized that its first-line defense had been seriously weakened by a number of factors. First of all, the combined fleet of the Imperial Japanese Navy had lost much of its strength in previous battles. Secondly, They lost many aircraft, and American air raids hindered the production of new aircraft. In addition, the aircraft they had a limited range of 560, so they could not support first defense, and even if the range was longer, those aircraft had to be used to defend the homeland. Adding to the Japanese Army's difficulties was the fact that so many pilots had been killed in previous battles during the war that there was a shortage of skilled pilots. However, General Kuribayashi wanted to cause great damage to the American forces and decided not to follow the existing Japanese defense tactics. Instead of fighting directly by building defensive lines on the beaches where American troops landed, General Kuribayashi chose a military strategy called defense in depth, which aimed to delay rather than completely prevent the enemy's imprisonment. This strategy relies on the tendency for an attack to lose momentum over time, or for the attacking force to disperse. Accordingly, the defenders were able to apply quarantine measures and accurately target the enemy's weaknesses. The ultimate goal of this strategy is to tire the enemy or force him to retreat. In particular, the island provided natural cover and resistance that was advantageous for defense. Huon Mountain was an ideal place to deploy concealed artillery weapons, and its steep valleys and deep canyons made the terrain difficult to cross. General Kuribayashi recognized that reinforcements were essential for the defense of Iwo Jima and began preparing for an attack. Large quantities of supplies, troops, and resources were sent to the island, and all civilians were evacuated. Armored tanks were brought in to serve as fixed artillery positions, and General Kuribayashi ordered the construction of an extensive tunnel and bunker system beneath the island. Thanks to Volcano, further progress was made in construction and other defenses, including blockhouses. This is because volcanic ash made it possible to make concrete of a much better quality than before. The Summer Rain Army's initial attacks achieved nothing other than forcing the Japanese to go underground. I found it. Mining engineers have drawn up blueprints for protection and ventilation of the tunnel system. Ultimately, 25% of the garrison was tasked with helping build tunnels and caves. Some of the rooms were small, but there were also large rooms that could accommodate 300 or 400 people. Many of the rooms were stocked with food, ammunition, and other supplies to last for about 3 months. Many entrances, exits, stairs, and connecting passageways were built together to prevent stings. The Japanese wanted to build one massive underground passage connecting all their major defenses, but they were unable to complete it in time. Still, February succeeded in creating a tunnel called 11 Dara. As well as digging these tunnels and bunkers, the Japanese also installed hundreds of camouflaged cannons and machine guns and sniper hitouts throughout the island. Although the Japanese army was generally well prepared, its defense was hampered by lack of supplies. The soldiers were only provided with ammunition equivalent to 60% of their usual combat needs and food to last for several months. They began bombing the coast of Iwo Jima. This attack lasted 9 months and is considered one of the longest and most difficult pre-bombing raids of the Pacific War. Many of the American soldiers participating in this attack soon concluded that they had applied enough firepower to kill most of the Japanese soldiers. However, they did not know that Japanese soldiers were hiding in the island's underground tunnels and air defenses. The Americans dropped bombs on Iwo Jima, but the attack had little effect on the Japanese defenses. Less than a month later, on January 1st, the U.S. military bombed the first airfield, but General Kuribayashi immediately dispatched troops, and the airfield was back in operation in just 12 hours. A few weeks before the battle began, American commanders again found themselves at odds. This time there was a difference of opinion between Major General William Blandy and Major General Harry Schmidt over the duration of the pre-landing bombardment. Harry Schmidt, commander of the Marine Amphibious Force, requested a 10-day attack, but William Blandy, commander of the Amphibious Support Force, refused to allow an attack that long. This request was declined, as it was believed there would be insufficient time to reload the ship's weapons before the Marines landed. Harry Schmidt shortened the period to 9 days, but William Blandy again refused. William Blandy believed that 3 days of bombing would be sufficient, and that there would be ample time to resupply. At one point, it was suggested that the use of poison gas shells would make it easier for the U.S. military to win, but Franklin D. President Roosevelt did not authorize the use of such weapons. The U.S. warships mobilized for this moon bombing were each assigned a section of the island to attack, and none of them could escape the bombardment. Each warship had approximately 6 days of continuous bombing followed by a pause, and bad weather in the days leading up to the landings made it difficult for commanders to truly know how effective their bombing raids had been. United States ship, 2 days before the Battle of February 17th began. Pensacola was bombed 6 times by the Japanese, and the U.S. military lost 17 men. This caught the Americans completely off guard, and the Japanese deployment of weapons proved very effective. Likewise, shortly after this incident, 12 small vessels, attempting to dispatch an underwater demolition team, were damaged by Japanese fire. The destroyer United States ship Roots was attacked while trying to defend a small vessel, killing 7 of her crew. The next day, bad weather and low visibility made it difficult for American ships to bomb the island. In the end, the U.S. military's method of bombing the island before landing was evaluated as not being very effective. The trenches created by the bombing served little purpose other than providing more cover for the Japanese. However, the bombing did help destroy several underground bunkers and caves, which was seen as a small victory for the U.S. military. By February 19th, Japan's defenders numbered between 21,000 and 23,000 men, and the battle involved approximately 60,000 U.S. Marines and several thousand U.S. Navy Seabees. The first U.S. Marine Corps units approached the shores of Iwo Jima. By this time, the weather had changed significantly, giving the Americans a clear view of the coast. At 8:59 a.m., the Marines landed on the island's southeastern shore after a short but tense boat ride. Jim Notter recalled, "Everyone was silent. Only 100,000 people knew the future." Each of the 5 Marine Corps landing waves was accompanied by 65 armor, landing equipment, and Trek M tracks. At first, everything seemed pretty simple to the Marines, but perhaps too simple. The Marines had been promised easy prison terms, and the lack of immediate Soviet resistance from the Japanese led some to speculate that earlier bombings had helped deter the enemy. But soon the loose volcanic ash covering the island began to become a problem. The soldiers said that about 30 centimeters of volcanic ash had fallen, and 4 and 5 meters. The steep terrace called Edda prevented most Amtrak from climbing it. The soft black sand also caused problems for the rocket launchers, and ultimately resulted in congestion, as Marines were unable to exit the area before the next wave of landing craft disembarked. The vehicle stopped, and the soldiers advanced. The island's coast was now littered with vehicles and equipment that Marines had abandoned in the volcanic disaster. When the beach was filled with landing armored vehicles and soldiers, General Kuribayashi fired a signal flare to notify his subordinates of the firing notice. Around 10 o'clock in the morning, machine gun fire and heavy artillery fire began pouring into the Imokema coast. The soft volcanic wounds left the Marines unable to build trenches to protect themselves from gunfire, and in just over an hour the beach turned into a nightmarish sight. Corporal Charles Johnson recalled it was a terrible sight. "I looked out at the beach, and it looked like hell." End of quote. Historian Derek Wright also said, to quote, "Virtually every shell hole lay at least one dead Marine." End of quote. First, the Marine Corps contingent eventually succeeded in advancing. At first it was less than a mile and a half, but then we advanced almost 2 miles. This was thanks to the help of soldiers from Naval Construction Battalion, number 31 and 133, who cleared the road with a bulldozer and helped their fellow soldiers move. Afterwards, the Japanese Army opened fire from bunkers, blockhouses, craters, and underground rabbit holes. Meanwhile, English-speaking Japanese soldiers pretended to ask for help to lure U.S. Navy medics. The American soldiers advanced in small groups and could not move in a coherent manner. The Japanese soldiers disappeared after firing from one place, and then fired a surprise shot from another place. Supporting naval ships moved closer to the coast and began eliminating some of the nearby Japanese military firing positions. But the Marines' mission was hampered by hidden mines, reinforced bunkers, and camouflaged artillery. What added to the Marine Corps' difficulties was their tactic of opening reinforced iron doors to protect themselves when the Japanese were firing, and then closing them again to prevent quarantine. Because of this, it was impossible to suppress the hidden heavy artillery on Mount Suribachi in a short time. In addition, the tunnels that the Japanese military had continuously built under the island. Although the Americans frequently used grenades to clear bunkers and caves, the Japanese would return to them when the situation was safe. This left many Marines perplexed when the enemy they thought they had just eliminated suddenly reappeared. On the beach, sappers blasted debris on boats and vehicles for the subsequent landing of Marines, some of whom used Amtrak too. We began moving heavy equipment from the shore. All of this work paved the way for Company M's Sherman tanks to enter service. These vehicles were particularly useful because they were difficult to destroy, and they had to expose themselves when the enemy attacked, leaving them exposed and vulnerable to enemy fire. By mid-afternoon, additional forces, including reserve battalions of 4 regimental combat groups and 2 tank battalions, were ready to deploy on Iwo Jima to support the landing force. Each of these reserve units also brought with it an artillery battalion. About 30,000 additional troops were sent to the island that night. The rest of the day was slightly better for the Americans, but Time Life reporter Robert Sherrod later described that first night as a hellish nightmare. Flares fired from American destroyers actually gave the Japanese more light to target the enemy, and medics had a hard time tending to the wounded without being shot. One medical unit lost 11 of its 26 men, and another unit lost 2 doctors and 16 medics. By the end of the day, approximately 400 American soldiers were dead. Despite these numbers, commanders remained hopeful that this first attack would be more successful than previous first attacks, such as the Battle of Saipan. The U.S. military prepared for an attack on Banzai, but General Kuribayashi judged it to be a waste of resources and banned his soldiers from fighting. Instead, small Japanese units used the darkness to gather intelligence, looking for weak points and exploitable gaps. During the day, the soldiers waited in defensive positions for the Marines to pass by. The next morning, the Japanese were bombarded by naval ships for about 50 days. He was imprisoned immediately after the incident. Harry Rivers, 28, commanded by Colonel G, attempted to approach Mount Suribachi, but despite the support of artillery and tank destroyers, 600 could not advance throughout the day. However, later that same day, the division reached its objective, first Airfield, and then turned to survey the Japanese's first major line of defense. Although he received an order to advance, Kuribayashi judged that it was not enough to protect the defense line alone. Lieutenant Colonel Chandler Johnson of the J Battalion reported, "The enemy's defense line is much stronger than expected. There is 1 bunker for every meter of the mountain. The support was okay, but it didn't destroy many bunkers or caves. The units occupied and imprisoned them one by one, causing serious casualties in the process. At the same time, General Kuribayashi gave final instructions to the defenders of Mount Suribachi. Quote, first, Iwo Jima must be defended until the end. Second, the enemy's weapons and troops must be destroyed. Third, you must kill all enemy soldiers using rifle and knife attacks. Fourth, all bullets must hit the target. Fifth, even if there is only one person left, we must continue to harass the enemy with guerrilla tactics. End of quote. Afterwards, the Marine Corps engineers cut the communication cable between personnel on the mountain and headquarters. On the 22nd of February, the 28th Regiment once again attempted to break through the defenses of Mount Suribachi. This time, with bombing support from the Navy and Air Force, the unit succeeded in breaking through close to the base of the mountain. General Kuribayashi deployed about 1,800 troops to defend the mountain. But this was only a portion of the troops he commanded. He added numerous bunkers and camouflaged weapons to reinforce the mountain, and the underground tunnel system was expanded to allow soldiers to take cover in elaborately dug underground spaces. The United States threw everything it could in terms of weapons to subdue the enemy in the mountains. Tanks, mortars, rockets, dynamites, flamethrowers, etc. were all used. Nothing was forbidden. Seawater and gasoline were poured into the area to flush out people hiding in underground caves and chambers, and sometimes the aforementioned flamethrower tanks were deployed. In the battle at sea, the Japanese sent kamikaze planes to attack U.S. Navy ships, including the United States ship Saratoga and the United States ship Bismarck C. United States ship Bismarck Poet caught fire and partially exploded, killing 200 sailors. The Americans expected it to be a particularly tough battle, despite their success in cutting off the troops on top and down the mountain. However, when two small rifle companies were sent to the top of the mountain, they met little resistance. Likewise, the larger reconnaissance party that followed found only a few defenders, mainly snipers, and most of the Japanese chose to remain within the cave system, where most were killed. At 11:20 a.m. on the 23rd of February, Lieutenant Harold Schreier of the 28th Marines climbed to the top of the mountain and planted the American flag. However, this original flag was replaced by a larger second flag later that day. This second flag raising was a famous moment in history, captured by Joe Rosenthal's photograph of the flag raising on iosmo.com. The photo later won the Pulitzer Prize for photography and is considered the most important and recognizable photograph of the war. In the process of taking the mountain, 800 Marines were killed, and 1,200 Japanese soldiers were either killed by American soldiers or were seriously wounded, blowing themselves up with grenades as the enemy approached. The raising of the flag boosted the morale of the Marines, but the fighting would continue for several more weeks. By this time, there were less than 8,000 pieces of land occupied by the Japanese on Ayokozuma Island. But once again, American soldiers were faced with a war for which the Imperial Japanese Army had been preparing for months. Not only did they have to deal with weapons that could shoot 700 bullets, but they also had to deal with the usual rockets, artillery, and machine gun fire. The Japanese soldiers were well trained and prepared to defend their positions to the death, and the northern part of the island was much more strongly defended than the southern part, where Mount Suribachi was located. General Holland Howland Madsmith, who commanded the entire operation, personally came to the island and witnessed the terrible battle, later reporting it was the fiercest and most costly battle in Marine Corps history. General Kuribayashi was still in command of about 8 infantry battalions, a tank regiment, 2 artillery battalions, and 3 heavy mortar battalions, so he could not easily be imprisoned by the Americans in the future. Both Japanese and American soldiers not only had to deal with each other's firepower, but also had to deal with an overflow of rotting corpses and a swarm of flies. To control these swarms, insecticides were sprayed from airplanes overhead to minimize disease and other risks. Fighting on the rest of the island took place mainly between armed American forces and hidden Japanese forces. Marines struggled to drive the Japanese out of the caves and ditches. An officer of the 2nd Marine Division recalled, "We had no effective way to destroy or neutralize the defenders in a very limited area, so the Green Line had to go in and draw them out in hand-to-hand combat. There must have been a better way." At this point, American forces had not yet secured J Airfield, located in the center of the island. The area was rife with rabbit holes, bunkers, concealed artillery weapons and mines, and the terrain was too rugged for tanks, making it even more dangerous for Marines trying to capture the airfield. On the 24th of February, members of the 21st Beach Dog Brigade attempted to charge at the Japanese soldiers armed with grenades and bayonets, and the Japanese soldiers also fired in the same way. The next night, the Marines eventually secured J Airfield, although they suffered heavy casualties and many of their tanks were destroyed by mines. During the occupation of J Airfield, American soldiers were imprisoned in 382 heights, which they called meat grinders. Because of the terrain, armored vehicles or artillery cannot be deployed here. It was a very difficult area that only infantry had to attack and secure. In the end, after changing their tactics, they succeeded in occupying the adjacent 360. The Japanese were accustomed to American tactics, large-scale bombing followed by ground attacks. As a result, the Japanese were always anticipating the Marines' next move, and were ready to come out of the caves and penitents and destroy the enemy with gunfire when the Americans began to advance. Because of this, the Marine Corps launched an attack at night without prior bombing, resulting in many Japanese soldiers being killed in their sleep. By early March, the American troops were completely exhausted. This single battle lasted over 10 days, much longer than the commanders had anticipated. The submarine force retained only 30% of its original strength. The situation of Japanese soldiers was similar. They lost many tanks, heavy weapons, and about 2/3 of their officers. Additionally, as supplies ran low, many soldiers became somewhat desperate and jumped under enemy tanks, with explosives strapped to their bodies. Communication between the soldiers and Kuribayashi was eventually cut off, with the result that many soldiers chose to go on the offensive, rather than follow the attack tactics instructed by Kuribayashi. Although that tactic had worked very well before, their aggressive actions exposed their positions to American forces and ultimately resulted in the deaths of most of them. On the evening of March 8, Captain Samagiano led a force of 1,000 men and broke through the American camp, killing 90 enemy soldiers and wounding more than 200 others. However, the Jesa Marine Division took control and killed about 800 people, including Captain Ino. The next day, the U.S. military saw that Kuribayashi's remaining troops had been split in two, making the advance much easier. Nevertheless, the Japanese army showed no intention of surrendering and continued to launch multiple assaults. Kuribayashi was well aware of the desperate situation the Japanese army was in, and the next day, it was recorded that the surviving troops of the Army and Navy in the northern region numbered 1,500, and on March 15th, he wrote that the situation was very serious. The forces in the northern region were approx. On March 14th, the United States thought it was all over and declared the occupation of Iwo Jima, but little did they know that the remaining Japanese soldiers were hiding underground. 3 days later, General Kuribayashi told his last soldiers that the war had reached its final moments. I hope that the surviving officers and soldiers will attack the enemy until the end. You have presented yourself to the Emperor. Don't think about yourself. I am always at your forefront. Later that day, Admiral Nimitz declared the island officially secured, but American forces continued to mop up what little remaining Japanese resistance until March 26th. On the same day, the Japanese army broke through the American defense line and discovered an encampment where they suffered about 200 casualties and were eventually annihilated by the American military's quarantine. There were rumors that Kuribayashi personally led the final assault, but his body was never found. It was soon announced that Operation Detachment was officially over, but in the weeks that followed, Japanese soldiers continued to be captured or killed. About one day, 83 Imperial Japanese Army soldiers survived this battle. The Battle of Iwo Jima was truly one of the bloodiest battles of the entire war, and even the American public was shocked by the brutality of its own troops. One newspaper called for the replacement of Admirals Nimitz and Sprans. But soon the next battle broke out, and interest in American military actions in these days faded. The Battle of Okinawa began just days after the Battle of Iwo Jima ended. In this battle, which lasted 82 days, the American and British troops suffered 84,000 casualties, and the Japanese army suffered 110,000 casualties. During this battle, as many as 150,000 civilians were killed. The United States won this battle, but both countries made great sacrifices. The Navy Department Library reported that the 36-day attack resulted in more than 26,000 casualties, including 6,800 killed. One of the dead was Lieutenant Harry Martin of the EC Corps, who led the defense during the last Japanese assault on enemy lines. Lieutenant Martin was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. 27 Medals of Honor were awarded, the most for a single battle in Marine Corps history. Admiral Nimitz said this about the American military. Among the Americans who served on Iwo Jima, extraordinary courage was a common virtue. General Holland Smith said at a press conference that at Iwo Jima, we showed the Japanese that we could take everything they had. Watching the Marines crossing the island reminded me of Pickett's charge at the Battle of Gettysburg. In addition to casualties, the United States lost many aircraft, including Grumman FM-20E Wildcat fighters, Grumman TBM-20 Avenger torpedo bombers, Grumman FUF, and 31 Hellcat fighters. They were lost in the sinking of the United States ship Bismarck C and in a kamikaze attack. Overall, the Battle of Iwo Jima remains a controversial battle to this day, and was strongly criticized by many even immediately after the battle. William Presson, retired commander of naval operations, said this to the press in January 1945. Consuming troops and occupying an island created by God it is useless as an assembly point for the Army and useless as a base for the Navy. I wonder if the same type of aircraft base could have been obtained at a lower price by occupying another strategic area. What Fred said also made sense. It has been pointed out that the strategic importance of capturing Iwo Jima lies in the ability to build an airfield and use it as a refueling station for aircraft. However, the long-range fighter escorts that were planned to be used here were eventually deemed unusual and unnecessary due to changes in tactics, and were therefore used only on 10 such missions were carried out on the island. The island was useful for raids by BX bombers, and was used for bombers to launch sorties. However, this was not a reason to occupy Iwo Jima in the first place, and its advantages were revealed only after the battle. This operation received much criticism because the Joint Chiefs of Staff did not consider the opinions of the Marine Corps, or the questions raised by those who participated in the operation plan. The Joint Chiefs of Staff's decision to push ahead with the operation left many people bitter. This gave the impression that the Joint Chiefs of Staff had acted recklessly, sacrificing many lives in battles without much benefit. To this day, the Battle of Iwo Jima is considered one of the bloodiest battles of the Pacific War. Of all those who experienced the battle firsthand, Corporal Jack Frazier of the 24th Marine Corps at JTE probably expressed those feelings best. On the 18th of Samel, more than a week before the operational separation officially ended, he wrote, "Iwo's men was secured. It was 27 days of hell.